What you see behind me right now is Lake Superior. It's the largest freshwater lake in the world, measuring almost 350 miles in length and 160 miles wide. It's both feared and respected by every captain and crew that has ever sailed her.
Besides the vastness of her boundaries, Lake Superior can lay claim as one of the most beautiful lakes in the world.
Well, it's pretty calm out there today, but it's not always that way. The legendary storms here have been known to kick up waves 25 and 30 feet high, which is how it got known as the graveyard of the Great Lakes. Today we're going to learn more about it when we discover the guardians and the ghosts of a lake the American Indians called Gitchigumi.
Lake Superior has the distinction of being the largest body of fresh water in the world, bounded by 3 states to the south and the province of Ontario to the north. The deepest and westernmost of the 5 Great Lakes, it is 350 miles long and has a surface area of nearly 32,000 square miles. Surrounded by lands rich in natural resources, Lake Superior has long been the major means of transportation in the region. Ports stretching from Duluth, Minnesota to Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan provided raw materials and in turn needed supplies to keep the wheels of industry spinning. And although the greatest of the Great Lakes provided an economical means of transportation, conditions on the lake oftentimes determined the fate of ship and crew. Rich in natural resources and blessed with an uncommon beauty. That's Lake Superior. But beware the careless. Her beauty has a side that no one who sails her waters is likely to forget. The northern shore of Michigan's Upper Peninsula has witnessed this darker side of Lake Superior. Here, the skeletons of both ships and men bear mute testimony to the unpredictable and often treacherous waters that lie in wait for the unwary mariner. The earliest explorers who plied these waters relied on experience and instinct to save themselves from the lake's fury. But as settlements developed and commerce grew, larger ships and the crews to run them were needed to meet the demand. And with modern sailing practices, crews could no longer rely on just slipping ashore to wait out a storm or keep land within sight for navigation. They needed a way to guide them from harm's way. And that guidance was found with the lighthouse. Adopted in use from Europe and later colonial America, the lighthouses that dot the Lake Superior shoreline became the savior of many a ship. They were the guardians. But even with the guardians and their life-saving crews, it sometimes was not enough as ships large and small continued to be lost to brutal weather and hidden shoals. Lake Superior soon became known as the graveyard of the Great Lakes. The remote city of Ontonagon was built on copper mining and timber, and with its fine natural harbor, it was an excellent shipping point as well. Here we found the westernmost lighthouse standing guard on the Upper Peninsula shoreline. Built in 1852 at a cost of $5,000, it was the 5th lighthouse erected on Lake Superior. The surviving lighthouse that you see now was built in 1867, completely replacing the original light. Despite the light, several shipwrecks that lie off Ontonagon's coast remind us that dangerous waters can be found nearly anywhere on Lake Superior. In fact, on the evening of November 21st, 1906, an upbound coal-laden steamship named the Panama was towing a schooner barge named the Matanzas through a fierce Superior gale. Besieged by the storm, the Panama was leaking badly. With her pumps unable to handle the surplus water, the captain of the Panama ordered the Matanzas set free to fend for herself. And in a valiant effort to keep her from sinking, the captain ran the Panama aground 14 miles off the coast of Ontonagon at Mineral Point. Using the yawl, the crew of the Panama fought their way to the safety of the shore. While the schooner barge Matanzas and her crew were eventually rescued by an Ontonagon fishing tug, the fate of the hapless Panama was decided that blustery November night. Caught on the reef, the steamship was battered to pieces by the waves and now lies flattened on the bottom. While this tale of the sea ended without the tragic loss of human lives, not all are so lucky. Traveling east towards the Keweenaw Peninsula, we realized that there were certain areas along the South Lake Superior coast that were potentially more dangerous than others, as witnessed by shipwreck charts and other documentation. We contacted Frederick Stonehouse, a Great Lakes historian and author of several books on maritime history, to enlighten us on the subject.
I'd say Keweenaw Point, in terms of a dangerous navigation hazard on the lake, ranks equally well with Whitefish Bay, often referred to as the graveyard of Lake Superior. Both of them are congested shipping points, and that shipping channels come together, especially in the early days of lake sailing when fog was particularly treacherous prior to radar. They both suffered their share of losses due to vessel collision. We've got about 50 wrecks that could be classified as Keweenaw shipwrecks, and many of them are in deep water, many of them are in shallow water and quite easily explored by divers, particularly those that are off the Eagle River area on what is known as Sawtooth Reef. That's a wonderful name for a reef, but it lay about a mile offshore, extends for about 4 or 5 miles, and you can find the gutted remains of at least a dozen different vessels on top of Sawtooth.
With horrific storms and gigantic Lake Superior waves imprinted indelibly on our minds, we looked out at this modern Great Lakes freighter and suddenly found it hard to imagine conditions that could toss it nearly out of the lake. But it can happen, and with deadly speed. During late spring and summer, Lake Superior can be a gentle giant. But as is often the case, October and November traditionally bring with them the violent weather that whips the lake to a frenzy. It is under conditions such as these that the respect for the lake of even the most experienced mariner is renewed. One such person is Lyle Peterson of Phoenix, Michigan. Lyle has spent his whole life working barges, ships, and tugs on Lake Superior. Lyle retired from the Ranger 3, a National Park excursion boat that regularly makes the trip from Copper Harbor to Isle Royale National Park.
Well, en route we encountered a fairly heavy southeast storm. So when we arrived at Middle Island Passage going into Mott Island, the water was all white over the rocks in there and was unable at that time to turn in there. So we went up to North Government Island to go into Rock Harbor. And on that turn, the Ranger, even though it's got a very experienced crew and everything, it laid over 43 degrees both ways, and the ship was designed for 45 degrees, no more or less than that. I started to turn because I was able seaman wheel operator, and My partner, Epi Judula, he took the wheel as I went downstairs. Why, I noted the engine room crew coming out of the engine room with their life jacket, one of them being Hank Holman. He was in doubts about retiring before we made that trip, but after we made that trip, he did retire off the Ranger 3.
No story of shipwrecks or lighthouses would be complete without the mention of Isle Royale. While providing some degree of protection for lake-going vessels from storms, the island has nonetheless claimed its share of ships, with the latest casualty being the steel steamer Emperor. Stranded when the vessel struck the Canoe Rocks, the Emperor now makes her permanent home at Isle Royale along with several other ships. The 4 lighthouses at Isle Royale mark hidden dangers for passing ships needing shelter from severe weather. From the Rock of Ages light, which enables ships to seek shelter behind the island, to the Passenger Island light, which marks the northeastern end of Isle Royale, these lights stand as lonely sentinels, safeguarding the passageway for passing ships. The Rock Harbor Light, seen here on Isle Royale's mainland, was originally built in 1855 to protect vessels entering the rock-infested Middle Islands Passage. The Keweenaw Peninsula, as we found out, is no stranger to violent storms and disasters at sea. This infamous stretch of water surrounding the peninsula can lay claim to its share of ships.
The Keweenaw has always been called by sailors, especially the early sailors on the Great Lake, as Old Treacherous, because of the way the rocky finger, bony finger, if you will, just kind of points itself out into Lake Superior. And when you get up around Keweenaw Point and you begin to put the X's on the chart where all the wrecks are, you will soon see the absolute danger that Keweenaw Point has. I mean, even as late as 1989, when the Coast Guard cutter Mesquite went up on the reef at Keweenaw Point, I mean, there's a modern Coast Guard vessel, fully equipped, every aid to navigation that man could provide, and yet she manages to be wrecked by Keweenaw Point.
As stated in the book Keweenaw Shipwrecks by Stonehouse, many of the early shipwrecks occurred near the old copper ports of Eagle Harbor, Eagle River, and Copper Harbor. As the mining activity shifted south to Portage River, and then later when the Portage Canal opened, the incidence of accidents increased in proportion. Because of the shipping activity in the Keweenaw vicinity, many lighthouses were necessary for the safety of the ships. The Eagle Harbor Light seen here was built in 1851 and keeps its vigil over Lake Superior and is still active today. Also, there is a fascinating nautical and historical museum within the lighthouse and surrounding buildings. There are yet some mysteries to be discovered when it comes to shipwrecks, and the Keweenaw Peninsula may hold the key. Fred Stonehouse tells us about a trio of French military minesweepers that ran into trouble somewhere in the vicinity.
During the war, World War I, all the shipyards in Europe were badly congested with war construction. So to construct the smaller vessels, they looked to out yards, and one of them in particular was Canadian Car and Foundry in Thunder Bay, Canada. Canadian Car and Foundry produced 12 identical minesweepers for the French Navy. 3 of them, the Botston, the Cyrusol, and the Inkerman, left in November of 1918 en route for delivery to France. Each one of them had a complete French naval crew of 36 men, including 4-inch naval artillery fore and aft, wireless, well-equipped vessels. They struck a storm in mid-lake. 2 of them were seen to turn into the storm in the vicinity of Keweenaw Point. The third lost track of them at that point, continued on and eventually made safety at the Sioux, the other two disappeared. Not a trace of the vessels has been found, not a body of one of the crewmen, not a radio message was heard. They disappeared just as surely as if the earth opened and swallowed them. And I'm convinced that those vessels will eventually be discovered in the vicinity of the Keweenaw Peninsula.
From this elevated view, we can see the Copper Harbor Light standing near the tip of this narrow, rocky peninsula. Copper Harbor Light served to protect the interests of early copper mining exploration until the gas light it contained was moved to the 60-foot steel tower nearby. Ships sailing from the north would encounter the wild and lonesome shoreline of the Huron Mountains, interrupted only by the beacon of the Big Bay Point Lighthouse. The Big Bay Point Lighthouse was built in 1896 and began service the same year. The keeper's dwelling is a two-story rectangular brick building with 18 rooms. The light station was manned until the Coast Guard automated it in 1941. As early ships sailed south from Big Bay toward Marquette, they would pass by the black rocks protruding from the tip of Presque Isle Point. This famous landmark was surely a welcome sight to the weary sailor, eager to set foot on land. Rounding the peninsula, the Marquette Harbor Lighthouse would loom into view. This beautiful lighthouse rests on an expansive stone bluff and was originally built in 1853, while the reconstructed version we see here was built in 1866. The city of Marquette originally prospered from the exploitation of timber and furs. In later years, iron ore from the nearby mines of the Marquette Range was hauled to Marquette by train and then loaded onto ships at the harbor's massive pocket docks. The original docks, which were built in 1857, were replaced by the ones you see now. These giant pocket docks, so named because of their construction, would receive the iron ore by rail and then deposit the ore into the ship's hold. Discontinued in use in 1971, these docks saw nearly 1 billion tons of ore pass through their chutes and now stand as a monument to the men who worked the mines. Getting a ship safely in and out of the Marquette Harbor was and is the job of the captain, and with the help of this range light, the task was usually completed without incidents. Many ships sailing into Marquette's harbor did not fare so well. In fact, during one storm that occurred on November 17, 1886, even the Marquette breakwater light was lost. During that storm, more than 30 vessels were damaged, with a loss of more than $500,000 and nearly 40 lives. Munising Bay is unique in that it has so many lighthouses and light stations in such a confined area. Here, Grand Island looms large as one approaches the bay from nearly any direction. And because of its size and close proximity to the mainland, lighthouses were needed at each end of the island, marking dangerous reefs and narrow channels. The Grand Island North Light was originally a 40-foot wooden tower, but because of its location atop the sandstone bluff, it was and still is one of the highest overlooking Lake Superior. The range lights at Munising were built to guide ships into the harbor through a narrow channel running east of Grand Island. Indeed, they were needed, as shipwrecks literally line the bottom here. In fact, there are so many shipwrecks in the area and preserved so well by Lake Superior's cold, clear water that this part of Lake Superior has been signed into law as the Alger Underwater Preserve. The preserve is a 113 square mile, crystal clear underwater playground for recreational divers. The most popular wreck for divers is the 223-foot wooden ore carrier Smith Moore. The big steamer was lost in Munising's East Channel as the result of a collision in the fog with the steamer James Pickens in 1889. The collision between the two vessels was typical of many such disasters that occurred on the Great Lakes before the days of radar. While most shipwrecks are the result of natural disasters, there are some that are man-made. Pete Lindquist of Grand Island Charters gives us an explanation.
I've been looking for something to sink here for probably 10 years, and to sink as a diving attraction in the Alger Underwater Preserve. And about every dive charter I go on in Munising, I talk to people about sinking vessels and if they're interested and things like that, and ask them what's needed, you know. And a friend of mine that I had talked to on the boat last year concerning this subject called me up in the middle of the winter and said that Selvig Marine had a tugboat they were going to scrap. And he had touched bases with Stephen Selvig, and they considered donating it to the preserve. What we'd like to do with the vessel is clean it up and make it squeaky clean, paint it, and get it back into a museum type quality where it's not running or anything, but so that when we sink it on the bottom, it's kind of like an underwater museum. And you know, we don't want it, I want it to look nice on the bottom, so it's a real good photographic situation. And the other thing about it is we want to make sure that in the process of sinking it, we want to make sure that it's a safe dive. We want to get it as shallow as possible so that you can maximize your bottom time on it and get have a good adventure on the Stephen Selvig. And we want to make it a penetration dive and maybe even put a little brass plaque in every room telling what things were and things like that, you know, and try and make it as interesting as possible.
During the 1860s and 1870s, there were no lighthouses along the heavily used coast between Grand Island and Whitefish Point. In June of 1872, Congress agreed to spend $40,000 for a light at Au Sable Point. Secluded in nature, it nonetheless is well worth the effort to visit. Starting at the Hurricane River Campground, we hiked the 1.5 mile service trail to the lighthouse and other buildings. Here, standing at the edge of Lake Superior, the light keeps its lonesome vigil for passing ships. With enough time for a leisurely stroll along the beach back to the Hurricane River Campground, we came upon something most extraordinary. Protruding from beneath the wet sand and gravel were the remains of several shipwrecks of an age long ago. Their wooden hulls lie partially submerged in only inches of cold Lake Superior water, a final resting place. We imagined that these once proud ships stood tall with their masts pointing defiantly against an angry Lake Superior sky, and rightly so, as these ships were the finest of their day. But now, lying broken in the sand, we couldn't help but think that the timbers that made up their hulls and masts were once possibly pine, spruce, and oak from these very shores. Even the spikes and straps that still hold together what remains could have been mined from the Iron Ranges only miles to the west. We continued down the beach, leaving these wooden skeletons at the mercy of the relentless pounding surf. To date, approximately 550 shipwrecks have been recorded on Lake Superior. The reasons are not unusual, with storm, fire, and collision being the most common. Their locations, as can be expected, tend to be in the areas with the greatest hazard, shoals and reefs, congested shipping lanes, and particularly rough stretches of water. For instance, the coastline from Grand Marais to Whitefish Point has been coined the graveyard of Lake Superior. Nowhere is there an area that has been as consistently dangerous, as more ships have been lost here than anywhere else on the lake. As Frederick Stonehouse's book, Shipwreck Coast, points out, there are essentially three reasons for this. First, the eastern end of Lake Superior is a very congested area. Whitefish Bay acts as a huge funnel, gathering downbound vessel traffic from everywhere on the lake. This downbound traffic must contend with upbound vessels as well. While designated shipping lanes and navigational systems have alleviated much of the problem, collisions and vessels running aground still exist. Another problem has to do with visibility. Sometimes snow squalls obscure the view. Other times, smoke from forest fires blackened the skies. But by far the worst problem was the legendary Lake Superior fog. The fog caused vessels to not only collide, but also to run aground. Before radar, fog, smoke, or snow were deadly. The third reason for the tremendous loss of ships was the great sweep of the seas. A typical Lake Superior storm usually bears down from the northwest, creating a sea of tremendous proportions. Storms roaring in from the northwest have 160 miles to build waves, and in some cases, waves have been reported at a height of over 30 feet. One such storm occurred on the evening of November 10th, 1975. What happened that night will live on in the annals of Great Lakes shipping history forever. On November 9th, a 729-foot ore carrier named the Edmund Fitzgerald was en route from Superior, Wisconsin to Detroit, Michigan, with a full load of taconite ore pellets. Near the vicinity of Two Harbors, Minnesota, she caught sight of the Arthur M. Anderson, another downbound ore carrier sailing for Gary, Indiana. With the Anderson following, the two ships would maintain radio contact until the Fitzgerald would seemingly disappear from the face of the earth. The storm that imperiled the Fitzgerald started over the plains of Oklahoma and gradually intensified until storm warnings were issued for all of Lake Superior. Due to the storm's intensity, the Fitzgerald and the Anderson abandoned the normal shipping lane along the southern shore and proceeded toward the northeast, about halfway between Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula. This new route would follow the old Fall North route that would offer more protection from prevailing northerly gales. While the Anderson was able to maintain radio contact with the Fitzgerald through to nearly the very end, snow eventually made visual contact impossible. What happened that fateful night is subject to speculation, conjecture, and theory, as there were no witnesses nor any survivors to the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. 29 men went down in a modern Great Lakes ore carrier that was only 17 years old. What actually happened that harrowing night? One man who thinks he may know is Lyle Peterson. Lyle shares with us his theory as to how the Edmund Fitzgerald went down.
My theory has always been that the water wasn't as deep as the boat was long, and therefore when it started to downplane, the propellers will push the boat to the bottom the same as it will on the surface, and I believe that the bow bumped bottom, and that's when it broke in two with no chance for any survivors. I really don't believe that people knew they were on their way to the bottom at that point.
So, did the Edmund Fitzgerald nosedive into the heavy seas and strike bottom with her bow, as Lyle Peterson suggests? Or did the Fitzgerald strike some hidden reef and rupture herself, sinking to the bottom? As the records show, the Fitzgerald did come close to the dangerous 6-fathom shoal north of Caribou Island. But did the Fitzgerald actually hit a reef while navigating around the island? On the weekend of July 4th, 1994, a group of international scientists sent a manned submersible to the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald to try to answer these questions. With sophisticated new equipment, researchers may be able to refute old theories, thus enabling them to narrow down the possibilities as to what sunk the Fitzgerald. This submersible, called the Keweenaw, was supplied by Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institution of Fort Pierce, Florida. Its mission was to conduct dives over the 3-day event and to record new video footage of the Edmund Fitzgerald. On the third and final day of the project, the Keweenaw had only one dive left to make. Anticipation ran high as the Keweenaw slowly settled at 530 feet to the Fitzgerald's final resting place. Once on the bottom, the Keweenaw would record on video the position of the Fitzgerald and hopefully new evidence as to what caused her sinking. The vicinity that the Edmund Fitzgerald sank can be classified as the Whitefish Point area. Aptly known as the graveyard of Lake Superior, Whitefish Point received the first light station on the lake. Tom Farnquist, director of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, tells us how the light station at Whitefish Point came to be.
When shipping began back here, just the turn of the century, around the early 1800s, ships that were on Lake Superior were either built near Sault Ste. Marie and were involved in the fur trade and so on. And then they went on to hauling cargoes of iron ore and, of course, copper, and then eventually the lumber trade. So they went through the whole evolution. The need for a light was established early when the schooner Invincible went down in 1816. From that period on until 1849, there had been a lot of shipwrecks on Lake Superior. So this was the site of the first light station, needfully so. It was the only place along the coast where ships could really duck in for safety around the lee of Whitefish Point. The next closest harbor of refuge is west of here, about 60 to 70 miles, and that's Grand Marais. And then Munising, Michigan, which is 80 miles from here. So this whole coastline offered no protection whatsoever. So ships coming down the lake trying to get to Sault Ste. Marie were desperately seeking the lee of Whitefish Point, and this marked that spot. It's a critical turning point also for all up and downbound traffic entering and leaving Lake Superior. So it's a very, very important, still is, functioning light today.
We also asked Tom about the museum found here at Whitefish Point and what plans the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society had for the future.
When we took the light station over in 1984, our plans were to, of course, restore the historic structures on site, but also interpret the shipwrecks along this coast. This is the Shipwreck Coast, the graveyard of the Great Lakes. There is a large concentration of shipwrecks that have gone down close to Whitefish Point, thus giving it the ominous title, Graveyard of the Great Lakes. And we've managed to locate about 25 previously unknown wreck sites. And we decided in 1985, after first opening our small exhibit on shipwrecks, that we were going to have to build a new building, because the popularity of our interpretive plan up here of course, far exceeded the ability to interpret all that history. So we constructed a new building, a very large building, is 2,400 square feet of interpretive floor space, and we interpret about 12 different shipwrecks right now. Of course, the earliest shipwreck, the Invincible, and the most recent one, the Edmund Fitzgerald. The other things that we plan on doing on site, of course, are expanding our video theater, where we actually take people down on the shipwrecks and give them a kind of a first-person account of what happened leading up to the wreck and the way it looks on the bottom today.
Once inside the museum, you're invited to a haunting world of over 170 years of Lake Superior shipwrecks. Inside, there is an enormous second-order Fresnel lens taken from the White Shoal Lighthouse near the Straits of Mackinac. Many maritime artifacts from past and present are on display as well. The museum is also a memorial to the many men and women who perished on the Great Lakes in our rich and varied maritime history. Finally, the submersible emerged from the bottom of the lake. Something on the faces of the crew that had just climbed out of the Clelia told us that something remarkable had been found. Another who dove the wreck site is Larry Elliott, president of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society. We asked Larry to tell us what he saw and to describe his feelings as he saw the Edmund Fitzgerald for the first time.
Couldn't tell an awful lot from the break on the bow section. So we swam across the debris field and got up to the break on the stern section. The metal was so jagged and twisted and the pieces were so huge that as we were beginning our look at the break on the stern section, we bumped up against something on the right side. We didn't know what it was. There were a few anxious moments in the sub, I have to say. We then tried to back out just a bit and ended up bumping again. So we decided, with the limited visibility we had at that point, which was maybe only about 15 feet or so, that we didn't want to pursue that investigation in that part of the wreck anymore. So we then went back and started looking through the debris field between the bow and stern sections. We wanted to see if there was anything else that we might spot somewhere along the way that hadn't been found before. Really, all that we found on that stretch was, number one, a little screwdriver sticking in the mud. That was quite interesting to us. It's hard to say whether it may have come from the Fitzgerald, perhaps as the stern section was flipping upside down. Maybe it even came from a freighter going by since and just dropped it over the side knowing the Fitz was there. Never really know on that one. But we did also discover that the lake bottom was extremely disrupted. There was such violence caused when the Fitzgerald went down that it just destroyed the bottom. There were huge mounds and valleys everywhere. Some valleys probably 10 to 15, 20 feet deep. Just huge valleys in the bottom and big chunks of clay laying all over. We were wondering at one point if some of that might have been part of the natural geology of the bottom. So we shot some video of that just in case. But we ended up working our way out to the edge of the debris field. We got to the edge of the debris field. Suddenly there was no more taconite. There was no more broken and twisted metal. But there were also no more chunks of clay anymore, and the bottom really leveled off. I think that tells us that all of this damage that we see on the bottom, all of that was caused when the Fitzgerald bowed in to the bottom.
If, as this new evidence points out, the Fitzgerald did not break up at the surface as once suspected, then she probably went to the bottom intact. The fact that the light and beacon at Whitefish Point was out from the storm did not matter. The Edmund Fitzgerald's fate had been sealed when she nosed into a great wave and, never getting the bow up, propelled herself to the bottom with all 29 crewmen still aboard. It's peaceful out there today. It's been many years since the Edmund Fitzgerald went down, and it seems inconceivable today that another ship could meet its fate at the bottom of Lake Superior. And yet, that is what was thought in November 1975. But sometimes nothing could keep a ship from her appointed date with the bottom.